Hello, and welcome to the latest installment of the Aras Innovator demo series. Today we're going to talk about ease of platform configurability. A quick note about the demo series: it runs for 30 minutes and features all demo with no sales pitch. Typically twice a month, we show you a different capability of the Aras Innovator platform. Once the demo is complete, you can visit our website, www.aras.com/demo-series, to view past demos as well as register for upcoming demos. We have on the line today Karsten Lees, Senior Consultant at Aras. Karsten, take it away.
Thanks, Nicole. Like Nicole mentioned, today we're going to go through the ease of the platform configurability, so how to configure Aras Innovator for your specific business processes. What we're going to go through today, some of the topics are going to cover things like item type creation, so things like list information, sequences, numbering, lifecycle maps, item types, so defining a business item, as well as the forms that represent those through the interface. Then also leading to things like the process modification. So again, we have a very robust things like change management processes, being able to change those to adapt to your specific business process the way you do it internally. And last, going through some of the how to extend that digital thread. So again, there's a lot of discussions that we've had for other demo series that talk about the digital thread and connecting items together. Basically, how do we connect that item type we created, this lab test in this case, and how do we connect it to existing items that are already out there? So things like parts, and kind of help to build out the digital thread to be able to extend and to be able to very quickly see relationships and interrogate additional content within that specific part. Very consistent messaging that Aras provides is things like the flexible, scalable, upgradable. Today we're going to look at the flexibility, so how we make those changes to be able to adapt Aras Innovator for your specific processes. I have Innovator open. I'm logged in as admin. It's the same interface. We're working with exactly the same interface. We're not having to log in as a separate client to be able to make administrative changes. It's all permission based. Again, as part of the administrator, we now have administration capabilities in the table of contents on the left-hand portion here. So again, we're going to go to a little higher level, so we're not going to cover a lot of the very basic information, kind of more how to make changes, how to adapt Aras Innovator for your specific purposes. Within the administration is where we start configuring items. So things like any kind of actions, be able to look at forms. Again, we're going to follow a process. So some of the opening slides, we took a look at some of the items we're going to create. One of the first things we're going to create is a standard list. We're going to create a lab test item type, in this case, business item, to be able to capture things like testing information and then relate that into our part. So some of the things we want to potentially create would be a list that has the lab test stations of where the testing is going to occur. We're going to have a standardized list for that. We're going to specify that we want this to be the lab test station. And then we'll start adding some of the values and some of the locations where we're going to do the testing. So let's say station A. And I'm just going to copy this to make it a bit easier for the entry here. So we'll say station A. We'll create one called station B, and then a station C as well. And then we'll save this. Very quick to be able to create a list that we can now reference when we start building and relate it to other business items as well. The next item that would potentially be required would be things like sequences. So I got a lot of questions on how to build sequences and sequence numbering within the Aras Innovator environment. It's very important to be able to understand and to track the number for the test potentially, numbers for documents. Out of the box, we have things like defining things like the prefixes. In this case, we'll say lab test for the sequence. We can define a prefix here. We'll make that LT dash. We'll say initial value is going to be 0, so it's going to be brand new. We're not going to start with a non-zero number. The current value, again, is 0. We can add a suffix if we like as well. So we have a suffix in there. We're going to pad that with zeros, and then we're going to have 4 spaces for the number. And we can also specify the step. If we're going to go by 1, by 10, define that step. This is very straightforward, very easy to define the sequence. We can also have things like smart numbering. So again, have more configured numbering based on the additional parameters that may be selected from the part definition, let's say location and such, be able to define a smart number. In this case, we're going to define a sequential sequence to be able to relate that to our lab test item that we're creating. So we'll save that. Another aspect that's very important as well are things like permissions. So how do you define permissions and relate permissions to the content you're creating? Maybe through Lifecycles, maybe through who can access particular items within the environment. To do that, to create permissions is very straightforward. We're going to select on the permissions underneath the admin area. And we're going to create a new permission called lab test and then a planned state. We'll define the permission to be the lab test, and we'll make this planned. Now we go through and define what other permissions and who's going to have the permissions associated with them. So in this case, we'll pick the identities. So either it could be individuals, it could be groups in this case. So we'll specify we know we want it to be quality. So quality group starts with Q, or anything that starts with a W. And the reason why W is that we're going to associate world. So world is everybody within the Innovator solution, as well as quality. Both those are going to be identities we want to associate permissions with for the plan state. And now we define what types of permissions they have. Checkboxes here make it very simple, very straightforward. So quality can get, they can update, delete, and they can find it. World can get, and they can discover it, they can find it. So again, they're not going to have the permissions to do things like delete, because only someone in quality would have the permissions to be able to do that. Go in here and define those particular permissions very specifically for that particular state. So we'll save this. What I also did previously to prepare, I just added a couple additional permissions, so things like lab test complete, lab test in progress. So if we look at complete, let's say, we now have the different identities. So in this case, only world we can get and discover, because once it's complete, we can't make any changes anymore. Okay, so again, it's defining what the permissions are and accesses to that particular item at that state. And again, we'll take a look at how that's applied to another business item. As part of the overall configurability also is defining things like life cycles and workflows. A life cycle is the states in which those particular items exist. And if we have a lab test, it's going to exist in a couple different states. So let's take a look at the lab test. I created a life cycle map initially to show you kind of how that maps out. So in this case, let's lock this. We can see here it goes from a planned state to an in progress. From in progress, we can go either to a retest or to a pass or a new state. This transition is also determined by an identity. So someone that's in the quality group can actually take it from plan to in progress. And then once we're in progress, either the owner can take it to past or new state, or it can go to the retest. Quality can define it to retest, and needs to be redefined. In this case, let's actually change the name of this one real quick here. So we can define, in this case, new state is going to be failed. We can also see we applied permissions. So in this, the lab test completed this permission that's assigned to this particular state. Since we just created the initial state, we created the in progress, we can go in now, since it's a brand new, for the initial plan state, we didn't have a permission yet because we hadn't created it yet. So in this case, we're going to select on the planned, and then we're going to take a look at specifically the state that we want to apply there. So in this case, we'll look at we'll search for the lab test states. So again, these are the 3 different lab test states. We're going to specify that it is planned. So we haven't, at that point, we haven't kicked it off yet. We're initiating the life cycle of the lab test here. From here, it'll be promoted into in progress. So we'll see what that looks like when we create the business item, the lab test, and show you how it promotes and progresses from one state to another as well. So we completed and finished this life cycle, and let's save that. We complete a lot of components now, the parts that go into developing and defining, in this case, a new business item for the lab test. To be able to create the new lab test, again, it's very straightforward, just like we've done. In this case, we're going to go to item types. And an item type basically helps to define the data we're capturing and the data that we want to present to the users and how it relates to everything else within the overall Aras Innovator PLM environment as well. So in this case, we're going to create a new item type. So we're going to create a brand new one again. And it's going to come up with a new template for an item type. And now we start defining some of the properties around that. So in this case, we're going to define what we want to create. In this case, it's a lab test. And we're going to call this, again, lab test, and then we'll call this lab tests. We can define things like class structure. So if there's classifications that are related to this particular lab test, so we may have electrical and mechanical, we can actually define those here as well. So again, define those classification. And we may have specific properties that we want to capture based on the classification. So again, be able to get very granular and capture information based on specific classification. But we're going to have just one type of lab test here. We can also define things like what kind of icon do we want to associate with this item. So in this case, we can pick from a rich set of library for the icons and select, again, there's quite a few. You can also, if you have some of your own, you can also select from your own as well. So we'll just pick one here and say we'll accept that one. And we'll take, again, another icon as well. Some of the other things you can also define in this case for the lab test are going to be things like versionable. Is it a versionable item? So is it going to be released and then we can create revisions or versions of that particular item? And what type of versionability is there for that? Also be able to define if we want to capture things like history. So do we want to capture history of this lab test? So as we make changes, do we want to track and manage and capture those changes as well? In this case, we have a default history template that's defined, but you can also go through and define what you want to capture the frequency we want to capture things. So again, be able to define how that information is captured. We can also define things like searching. Is it, when we select on the table of contents, is it automatically going to search for us? How many records is it going to bring back automatically? Let's say we want a page size of only 25 records at a time. So again, defining all this information about this particular item type. There's also additional items, so things like if we allow private permissions. So a little more detailed information that we're not going to cover today, but again, there's a lot of configurability, a lot of settings we can define for this item. So again, at a high level here, we're defining information or behaviors about the item type. Now on the bottom portion is where we start defining how it interacts. What are we defining with this particular item? So what properties do we want to capture? The first we want to capture in this case is going to be information about the test number. So it's important for us to understand the number for the test. Okay, to be able to provide tracking, be able to relate it and understand what we've worked on. So in this case, we'll say number. We'll just get rid of this. And you'll see why I put the A in front of that. So kind of help to group those together alphabetically. And we can go through and define, in this case, we're going to select, there's a lot of different data types we can specify here. So in this case, we can define things like strings, text, integers. What we're interested in doing in this case, though, because it's a number, it's selecting the sequence. And what we want to do is select a sequence that we created earlier. So in this case, we're going to go through and define, let's say, lab. Let's search for the lab sequence and associate that lab sequence with this particular property we just added. We're going to add some additional, again, there's a lot of additional properties we can configure here as well. So things like if it's a required field, if it's going to be unique, so can we have duplications of these values in there, or do they have to be unique values? Is it going to be indexed for enterprise searching? Be able to go through, it's not start defining very specifically what we're interested in, the behaviors we're interested in for the properties. Also, for the searching, we'll take a look at the table of contents. For searching, is it going to be visible and searchable, or is it going to be hidden from the search area? Also, you can see here, so things like if it's default values, if we want things like, we'll define a sort order, let's say 1. And again, these are some of the additional configurations that will define what's displayed on the tab across the top when we do a search. All right, let's add a new property here. In this case, it's going to be the test station. And then we're going to select, in this case, it's going to be a list. So in this case, we can also type in here. So if we know it's a list, we can type the value in here and pick it right off. So it'll pre-fetch that information for us as well. So in this case, we'll pick the list that we created. So that's going to be the lab. We'll search again. And the lab test station. We'll add another property here that's going to be a description of what the test was. In this case, we'll call this, what information is important for us? So what else do we want to capture to help define the data that we're specifying for this particular lab test? In this case, we're going to specify that we want this to be text. And we'll select one more property, or create one more property and call this test results. And this is going to be an item. So we're going to reference another business item to specify that we want to capture. In this case, it's going to be a file. So we can go through and specify we want to create a file, or relate a file to this particular item, and be able to manage that file. So things like a Word or Excel, and be able to capture that as part of the lab test that we're capturing. When we save this now, what you'll see is that it's going to automatically create some additional properties as well. So kind of more system level properties. So things like when it was created, when it was last modified, properties that relate to the overall definition of the item type for capturing data that's part of the system. Who created it, who modified it last. So one of the ones that a couple of ones we are interested in are going to be modification of the owned by. So we're going to take the owned by ID. So if we scroll down here, we can see here there is an owned by ID. We're going to make this one the owner. Okay, so we're going to utilize that item as well. And then for the state, so we're going to take the state. This is an identity for the owner. And then the state is going to be the status. Okay, and then let's save this again. We've gone through, we've specified the properties we want to capture. Let's now take a look and how that would actually look on a form. So again, it's one thing is defining this information, but how do users interact with this now? So select on views now is where we define the forms for this particular lab test item type. By default, there's a single form created. And this form will take the properties we added and by default display those on the form. And we can see here that the ones that we added with the test number, station description, and test results are populated on that form automatically for us. What we can also do, we can quickly move this around to get to the properties and the properties, the locations we want those. But we also want to add things like the owned by. So we created that owner ID. So actually go through and move the owner over here. And we also wanted to add the state, the status of that particular lab test. So we'll put the station here, and the test result, we'll put that over here. So again, laying it out the way that makes sense for you and kind of the best way to capture this information. So we'll actually have the test number by itself up here. And that looks good for now. So we can always change it it's not locked for forever. It's something that's very easily changeable. Just lock it and make the changes. So we'll select that and save it. Now what we want to do is also define some additional properties here as well. So things like we define the life cycles. This lab test is going to have a specific discrete life cycle. The life cycle we just created, we're going to associate that with this lab test. So we're going to go through and search for that life cycle we created. So in this case, called lab. Search for it. We'll say lab test. We're going to go through and define where are we going to see this. So the TOC access is what we call the table of contents access. Who's going to see it in what locations? Again, where do we want to find this? Where do we want to locate this particular item? So we're going to say for world. So for everybody, it's going to be located underneath, let's see here. There's several different categories already. Because it's more of a testing, we're going to say make that part of quality management. Be able to go through this now and define who can actually add this as well. So who can add a new lab test? In this case, we're going to specify that everybody can add a new lab test. We'll search here, and it maintain that criteria we specify for our search, so we don't have to keep re-entering the same criteria. In this case, we'll say so we want world. It can be added. And again, we can have the can add based on the class as well. So if we define a certain classification structure, it can differ as to who can add that and save a new lab test. It's going to be very specific on these capabilities for who has certain access and permissions allowed. The last item here, we want to go through and add permissions. All right, so in this case, we'll pick the permissions and we'll say again, lab test, and we will make this the planned because it's the first step. So we'll say planned, and that is the default. As you can see, there's several additional relationships that we're not going to touch right now. So things like events, so actions that would occur on the server and such. Those are things that we're not going to do right now since we're creating our lab test example. So in this case, we'll save this. And let's take a look at what that looks like now. So we'll take a look at the item type that we just created. Let's actually go back in our table of contents. And we'll scroll down to our quality management here. Under quality management, we can now see the lab test is an item type that we can now create new items from. So in this case, we can have the lab test with the icon. Let's create a brand new lab test. The layout of the form that we just looked at. So in this case, we can take a look at test station. Let's say A. We can define the owner here. In this case, let's make it Innovator. So Innovator admin. So if we make it somebody else, the permissions for owner are the one that's going to control who when it gets promoted into the next state of that life cycle. So in this case, we'll say Innovator admin is the owner. If we want to select a file in this case for, let's say documents, let's just pick this here. So we'll a document here that we can manage as part of this overall test. And let's say initial test. And then when we save this, we also notice that it now creates the status for us automatically as well. So in this case, we can see the status is going to show us the initial state. So it's a planned state. We can also see that if we go up here into views and look at the life cycle, this shows us a life cycle map for this lab test. Again, the one that we created and we added the permissions to the planned. We can see here that it goes a plan to in progress. To be able to promote it from one state to another, it's just to see how that works. We can go through and define, lock that, and now we can promote this from one life cycle state to another. So in this case, we want to go to in progress, and it promotes it now to that in progress state. What we want to do now, again, this doesn't exist by itself, so the lab testing doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's typically related to something else, right? So it may be related to things like a part potentially. So again, the part may have relationships to a lab test, so that any kind of testing that gets done for that particular part. So let's take a look at real quick here, a part. And we'll modify parts. Again, these are existing ones that we currently had within the Aras Innovator solution. There's thousands, hundreds of thousands of these already configured. But in this case, what we're going to do, we're going to go through and modify, and we're going to edit our part definition and add, in this case, a relationship. So how does this lab test, or how does it relate to other items? In this case, we're going to specify that we're going to define a new relationship type and actually specify that we want a connection between the lab test we just created and a part record. So in this case, we can go through now and say search for and create a relationship between the lab test. Again, we're doing all this without writing code. It's all just, it's with the interface, and be able to now do this very quickly, very easily, without having to write and compile any kind of code, which is it's very powerful. So we'll pick the lab test. We'll add that lab test into as a relationship. And we want to locate it, let's say about right after, let's say let's make it about 200 for the position. We'll call this a part lab test. And the label, we'll call this lab test. And then let's save that. So now when we go into the part, look at a part definition, under design, look at part, let's create a new part here. What we'll see is that this part now has a lab test related to it. So we'll relate that lab test directly to it. So in this case, we'll say MM dash, so part number, let's say new part. And then we can pick the lab test directly from here as well. So again, not starting to build that thread and have the connectivity between the individual items. So we can see here as well. So we'll pick the lab test, again, to automatically search for us the results that are available. So we now basically what we just did is associated that lab test to this particular part, starting to tie that information together and create that digital thread for that development process. One of the other quick items as well, just to show you some modifications of things like a workflow potentially. So we may want to go through do a quick example for an ECO, how to make a modification to an ECO. So we'll say star ECO star. We have, again, very out of the box CM2 compliant ECO workflows. So we have an example here of an ECO that follows the CM2 principles. Be able to add a new, again, it may be exactly what you want. You also may want to changes. So in this case, we can add an activity. Again, very quickly make changes to this particular item. So let's say review. We're going to define who is assigned to it. So in this case, the owner, in this case, is going to be assigned to it to review. And then we may want to just define the transition. So we're going to add a path between the submit to review. And we'll define this as review. From review, we'll go to planning. And this is going to, again, be planning. And then we'll go from review to cancel. And basically, so what we just did is we added a new activity in that the ECO workflow, basically added a review state. And what we can do then is, and let me show you real quick what that looks like when we add a part, in this case, to that ECO approval process. So in this case, let's go through and unlock this. And we'll add this particular part to an ECO. So in this case, we can take that part, add it to a change process. Let's take a look at and make this the Express ECO. We're going to create a brand new one. We'll say OK. And we'll just say release part here. We can see that the part is automatically added to our ECO process, our ECO form. And we'll just, let's say initial release. When we save this, we can see that it's going to assign the ECO number automatically as well and define the state that it's currently in for the ECO. And let's take a look at what the workflow, again, there's a workflow associated with the ECO. So if we take a look at that workflow, we can see that the change we just made, where we added that review state, is now available as a workflow activity in this overall ECO process. So again, very quickly be able to make these changes to be able to define, let's say, maybe an additional view state that may be required before planning, or it can go directly to planning. So again, based on the decision of that at the submit ECO state. At this point, we can go through, if we want to submit this, we can go through and under sign-offs, when we move to the next activity, and complete the initial activity, we can see here that there's different states that are available. So in this case, we're going to vote this to go to either the submit planning or the review, so the new state that we just created. So again, we can go say complete. And this now, when we take a look at our workflow, we can see in this case that we have promoted it to the review state that we just added. So again, we can see the yellow square is showing us that we promoted the review state and we can complete additional work. So again, today we showed you how to add components for the definition of a new business item. So things like the sequences, the lists, defining the item type and the forms and such. Be able to make changes to things like the life cycle, the states in which it exists. Be able to also make changes to the workflow very quickly, very easily, without having to do any kind of coding. It's something that can be done direct to the interface, be a lot of drag and drop. Be able to make these changes and adapting the Aras Innovator solution to your specific business needs and be able to capture your specific processes. Were there any questions, Nicole?
Yes, I'm going to go ahead and just get to a few of those. So is there an easy way to copy the configurations from one environment to another?
There is absolutely. It's something that we go over that during our Configure and Developing Solutions classes. There's a way to create packages through the administration capabilities, to create packages and export those packages from one environment and import those into another environment. So again, you don't have to recreate the solutions you developed in one, let's say a test environment or development environment. The packaging is a very effective way to take it from a development environment and migrate it into a production type environment.
Is all the configuration done in the same interface?
Yes, absolutely. There's no different interface. We don't have to get a different client potentially to make the changes. The capabilities to make changes, these administrative type changes, the configuration changes, are based on permissions. By logging in as an administrator and having permissions granted allows me to start building new item types, start building new lists and such. Again, it's all permission based. It's not interface or client based.
Okay, I'm only going to take one more so we kind of stay on time here. Can you have different or multiple forms for the item type?
Yes, so you may have class-specific forms. You have, let's say, if it's electrical testing, if it's mechanical testing, you can have different forms that relate to that different classification and present just the properties for that classification. So absolutely, you can have multiple different forms on here as well.
Thank you everyone for your questions. I apologize for any that we didn't get to today. I'm going to leave everyone with what's upcoming. On February 21st, we'll be covering connecting the dots, see your PLM data in a whole new way with graph navigation. Then on March 7th, we will be discussing leveraging Aras PLM with your SolidWorks implementation. Again, you can register for upcoming demos and view any past demos at www.aras.com/demo-series. We'd love for you to join the open Aras PLM community. We have blogs, forums, community projects, and knowledge bases with a lot of good information. Be sure to follow Aras on social. You can find us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook, where we share industry-related news and articles, the latest Aras news, products, assets, and more. Finally, be sure to register for ACE US 2019. We will be coming to Phoenix, Arizona this April from the 15th to the 18th. We would love to see you all there and hear your feedback. ACE is the perfect opportunity to network with a PLM community, Aras employees, partners, and more. We thank you for joining us today and look forward to having you on next time. Thank you and have a good day.